where we've come with the project. And I think the people on the steering committee would be disappointed if I didn't mention that we've talked about this project within the steering committee as the process of sculpting fog. That if I didn't say that today, everybody would be disappointed because I repeated it over and over again. But it was really taking the area that was sort of amorphous and trying to make it much more concrete and actionable. And I hope and have been encouraged by what I've heard today that we may have succeeded in being able to do that. But we didn't answer all the questions, and indeed, as part of the process, identified places where there's a lot of additional opportunities for work. And so I wanted to discuss that a little bit and really talk about what's in Section 8 of the report, which is the agenda for future work in this area. And as I mentioned at the beginning, our goal for this report really is that it's not the ultimate definitive piece, but it's a working document, a first initial thought piece in a nascent area of thinking, a nascent area that's developing, that we can then continue to build on as we collectively within FDA and industry and patient groups and academia learn more about how to undertake and use patient preference information. And so we identified in our discussions areas where we just didn't have the answers and where we thought there was much additional work needed. And so that's summarized in the last section of the report. And I want to highlight a couple of key areas that we noted. I don't know why this thing's not advancing. There we go. The areas we broke the areas down as the issues related to methods. You know, the work that Brett and his team did, and looking at that, what are the additional methodological work that we needed? And we focused on 4 areas: the choice of method, the sample selection, how you actually develop and do a study, and then how you determine study validity, which is an issue that's come up before. And then beyond that, within the use of the information, what you have it, is where there's really need for additional work in gaining additional experience with collection and analysis of that information, with how to effectively communicate that information, particularly to providers and patients, so it can be used in the patient care process. And then using this information in the other fields we've talked about, things beyond the regulatory process, reimbursement, marketing, shared medical decision-making. Within the issues related to methods, there's really an issue about the choice of method. And one question came up that we just don't have the answer for is, if you use different methods to assess patient preferences, do you get the same answer? And there's I think the Deshanes group and John Bridges had done one study where they used 2 different methods to ask the same question and got relatively similar results. I think there's more work. We think there's more work needed in these areas to look at not only how do you do each method, but if you use different methods, do they come to the same, lead to the same conclusions? Another important area is actually how do you determine how do you sample and how do you do your sample selection, and really what sample is representative of the population under study. An important sub-question within this is, does patients who've seen treatments before, have been faced with decisions where made selections, experienced treatments, do they view things differently than treatment-naive patients? And we just don't know the answer to that, but those are questions that have come up. I don't know why this thing's not advancing. Within the issues related to developing a study, the really important area is how do you actually define the important attributes you're going to study? Because you have to not only define the patient population, but you actually ask them what attributes of the technology or the treatment you're going to actually look at. How do you define those? And then how do you communicate information about those to patients so that they can give you a sense of their preferences accurately? And we need more work in understanding the best practices for doing that. And finally, to the question was asked earlier about study validity, we just need to develop standards in this field that have been developed in other fields like PROs around developing standards and methods for assessing the validity of studies in this field. And with that will come with more experience in the field. Beyond the method issues, there's just a general need for more experience in this field. The obesity study was really, within the medical device space, the obesity study was the primary example we could find of somebody who had actually gone out and done a formal preference study. And so we leaned heavily on that study, as you'll see in the report. But we just need additional work in this field and want to encourage that. Specific areas where more experience would be valuable with, as we mentioned, using the variety of methodologies and seeing how they all work in terms of getting to the answers we need for the regulatory process. I think we need more experience in seeing how this information can be used in the regulatory process, and I hope with the benefit risk, with the guidance that came out today, that will encourage companies to include patient preference information as part of their submissions. We also need to learn how to most cost-effectively do these studies and how most efficiently to do these studies, because they do take time and money, and that's additional cost to an already expensive product development process. So we don't want to add, we want to figure out how to add the least possible burden to the process of getting a product approved. And finally, we need to really focus on learning how to best communicate that information, not only to FDA staff, but also to providers and patients and others in the healthcare community. We also identify what we felt were opportunities. One is the opportunity to collaborate on these studies. So the CDRH obesity study was undertaken by the FDA to look at this area, but it's really benefited industry. And there's no reason that we can't look at new and emerging areas of technology and say, we see this coming down the pike, we know it's coming, let's collaborate among different industry members and also with the FDA to develop studies that will make life easier on all of us as we go to figure out how to regulate these products. Some areas that clearly are evolving are things with less invasive technologies, where you have alternatives that are less invasive compared to more invasive. And a particular area of interest to me, because we're seeing this more and more, is places where devices are moving to areas that have typically been treatment of chronic disease that have been typically serviced with drugs. And we're seeing, particularly in neuroscience and as we develop non-invasive neurostimulation techniques, that we are increasingly doing device trials in areas where the way to do those trials has been defined by the drug side. And we really need to understand how patient preferences for devices versus drug may play in those particular disease states. In order to help collect this collective knowledge, we thought that it might be useful to develop a repository of patient preference studies. There's a very nice repository of cost-effectiveness studies that's maintained by the Tufts Group. We might similarly, as we develop, get all the published and even some unpublished work that could be used as a background for people who want to do additional work in the field. So the idea of developing a repository is something we'll be discussing in MDIC and perhaps figuring out how we might do. And then finally, as we get more experience, we might be able to develop tools. We said that this report is not a cookbook or algorithmic process, but as we learn more, we might develop that there's some good rules of thumb, some algorithms, some ways of helping to make this process more efficient. And if so, we should try to codify that. The benefit risk tool in obesity that Telb and Martin have created, I think, is a good example of how those might be helpful, and particularly in emerging fields of new technology. In terms of additional work that might come out of this issue of communication, how to best communicate benefits and risks to patients and providers, I personally think is a very important area. The good news is there's been a lot of academic work done in different aspects of this, and I think one of the next projects we'll consider is whether we want to undertake bringing that together and reviewing that literature and understanding, at least for industry and perhaps for the FDA as well, what are the best practices for communicating benefits and risks to patients, and how might we use that to inform labeling around new products, and thereby improving informed decision process, informed consent processes, as well as promoting better shared decision making. And then a question that's also come up is, are there, and this issue I think has been looked at by FDA in the past, but as we develop more preference information, is there a way to build on the experience of obesity studies and other work to develop quantitative ways of looking at benefit risk to more standardize it and make it a more efficient process? And these are areas where there are people like Bennett who are expert in these fields that we hope will help advance the ball in that area. And then we also want to consider how patient preference information could be useful in post-market studies, particularly for expanding indications and for these other issues of reimbursement and shared medical decision-making and marketing that our companies encounter after the regulatory approval process. And beyond this, as we've talked today, there will be applications. This is not just an issue for devices, also a question of how to do this better in drugs. And I'm sure that there will be additional work in those areas as well. So there may be also additional things we haven't thought about. We do not think our report is the be-all and end-all in the area of patient preference analysis. We think it's an initial thought piece. We're hopeful that there'll be constructive feedback once this report comes out, that we'll all collectively learn more about how to improve thinking in this area. And we welcome that feedback. And so we hope in the end this is going to be a useful document and that it will really encourage continued growth in thinking and experience in this field. With that, let me stop and we'll move into our discussion.